And San Francisco's mayor warning the city's children are suffering after Democrats take on their own party, ousting 3 members of the school board. Let's go out front. And next, voters in one of America's most liberal cities, San Francisco, ousting 3 members of the city's school board in part because they didn't reopen schools fast enough. Next, I'm going to talk to a mother who was a longtime Democrat and helped lead the recall effort. Tonight, San Francisco Mayor London Breed taking aim at the city school board's performance during the COVID pandemic. This after a resounding rejection of the board by voters who overwhelmingly supported, and by that way, when I say overwhelmingly, I mean it, more than 70%, a recall of 3 members of the board.
The frustration, the uncertainty, the inconsistent information, the lack of clarity, the bickering, the politics, and who suffered the most? Our children.
San Francisco public school kids did suffer. They stayed closed for full in-person learning for 17 months, from mid-March in 2020, like obviously across the country, all the way till August of 2021. And while they were closed, the school board pushed forward on other things, like renaming 44 schools because they were named after public figures the school board deemed controversial, because those figures were linked to historical injustices like slavery, genocide, and the oppression of women. They were focusing on that as the kids weren't in school, and that incensed many voters. Out front now, Jennifer Say. She is a mom, a longtime parent of kids, formerly in public school in San Francisco. She was a vocal Democrat for 30 years and became a vocal advocate for reopening schools during the pandemic. She recently resigned as the brand president for the jeans company Levi's, saying she was pushed out over her views. And Jennifer, I really appreciate your time tonight. And I do want to get to your personal story in a moment. But first, as a mother, you, as a longtime San Francisco public school parent, you were publicly pushing for schools to reopen. You publicly pushed for this recall. How did you feel when you learned about this vote? More than 70% of the people supported the recall. How overwhelmingly successful it was.
Yeah, I mean, it was incredibly decisive. You know, parents made their voices heard. And, you know, what I felt was people were opposed to the school closures all along. People were frustrated with the Board of Ed all along, in that they were focused on much less important issues than getting the schools open. But parents were afraid to speak out over the course of the 17 months of closures. Not all parents, but many. But they've now made their voices heard. And I think it's really problematic that people were afraid to vocal on this issue and push to get schools open. I think there was a silent majority that knew that schools needed to be open, and they were afraid because if you veer from the sort of mainstream narrative or the orthodoxy, there's recrimination.
Well, certainly that's what we saw in that vote, right? You talk about a silent majority. That's what that vote shows, that would be correct in San Francisco. And, you know, Jennifer, talking to you, and, you know, I've been watching a lot of your posts here over recent months. You know, we've heard from other longtime Democrats, right? You talk about that you were a Democrat for 30 years. There are others like you who are deeply frustrated with the party's COVID school policies specifically. Here's an Ohio parent that my colleague Evan McMorris Santoro recently spoke to. I wanted to play something she said specifically to you.
If you would have told me like 2 years ago that I would be alienated from the Democratic Party, I wouldn't have believed it. I just don't think people realize what a big deal closing school for a year was. Why is my son, who's double vaccinated and already had corona, masking 40 hours a week when no one else is in our society? He's low risk. That's another thing. I think Democrats have been way too dogmatic about that.
So what lessons do you want Democrats to learn, Jennifer, from you, from other parents like her, who clearly have some of the deep frustrations and anger that you do?
Yeah, I mean, I want them to listen to us. I still feel firmly rooted in what I thought were the values and principles of the Democratic Party, and I feel they abandoned those principles, specifically around kids and access to public education. And you know, what we're faced with is being scolded and being anti-science and being racist. And, you know, I want the party to listen to us. I feel alienated from the party. I feel like it left me. I didn't leave it. It left me. I stayed true to the values.
which is a very interesting way of saying it, that it left you as opposed to you leaving it. And now I want to talk about, you obviously chose to move your family to Colorado during this because of the school issue. But you worked at Levi's for more than 20 years, Jennifer. You became the company's brand president. You were at the very top, the very pinnacle. You said the CEO of Levi's said that you were on track to be the next CEO. And then you say you resigned so you could keep speaking out. Now, I wanted to read to you the statement that the company sent to us, part of it. It's quite long, but I wanted to read the key part to you, Jennifer, and give you a chance to respond. So they say, Jen's statements about COVID-19 public health measures undermine the guidelines we were following to ensure the health and safety of our employees and customers. All of our leaders, and especially executive officers, have a responsibility to put our values and health and safety at the forefront of their actions. This was especially true during the global pandemic. Jen decided to leave the company and resigned. Tell me why it was so important for you, Jen, to speak out despite the consequences here of this happening to your career.
Yeah, I mean, I would start by saying I did not undermine the guidelines of the company. I spoke specifically about children in school and the need for schools to be open. When I did talk about masking, it was for young, very young children. You know, I have a 5-year-old who's been wearing a mask her entire life. So I was very precise and specific and was completely focused on children. What I experienced was, a tremendous amount of pressure not to speak out. And I just think it shouldn't be an HR violation to have opinions on matters that affect me and my family. I just don't think companies can operate that way. It's viewpoint discrimination. I'd been outspoken about other political issues in the past. And let me just say, I don't think kids and free speech should even be political issues. But my views that I'd expressed in the past were considered to be just fine. But this position on schools specifically, veered from, frankly, what the Democratic Party was doing and what Deep Blue cities were doing. And so it was considered unacceptable. I never advocated for violating company guidelines. And so, this issue of speaking out about kids and schools became intertwined with issues of free speech and viewpoint discrimination. And that's why I felt it was so important to walk away on my terms, because I wanted to be able to talk about that. And, the likelihood of me being able to do that, the necessity of signing a non-disclosure agreement when you're sort of pushed out and laid off, I wouldn't have been able to. And these issues are too important to me, kids and free speech. And it felt hypocritical. It felt just too hypocritical. I would have been giving up any integrity that I might have if I were to sign the non-disclosure agreement and not talk about this.
Well, Jen, I really appreciate you talking about it and sharing your story with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Erin.
All right. And next, the January 6th Select Committee about to learn who Trump may have been meeting with on the day of the insurrection.